Trouble River by Betsy Byers, Chapter 3, Escape by Moonlight. What happened? What happened? Grandma asked, staring at Dewey with eyes that were dazed and uncomprehending. She had been awakened abruptly from her sleep, and she could not understand why Dewey had thrust her aside and grabbed the gun. Dewey's chest was heaving so rapidly he could not speak for a moment. Then he said it was an Indian. At the mention of the fearful word, she stepped back. She sat down hard in her rocking chair. Indians, she said starkly. The dog whined, and Dewey looked away from the horizon and at him for the first time. Then he stepped quickly from the cabin and picked him up. Look at his leg, Grandma. He can't hardly walk on it. He set the dog in the cabin and closed the door. Although his hands were shaking, he held a splinter in the glowing ashes of the fireplace until it flamed, and then he lit the oil lamp with it. Indians, Grandma said again. The boy swallowed and wiped his nose on the sleeve of his shirt. I gotta fix Charlie's leg, he said. Then he added loudly, anyway, it was just one, Grandma. She rolled her eyes to the ceiling. As the boy looked for cloth to bind Charlie's leg, she said, there ain't no such thing as one Indian. Dewey paused. The glow he had seen on the horizon gave truth to her words. He pulled a piece of muslin from a drawer and began to tear it into strips. Now the urgency of looking after the dog began to replace his fear. Maybe Pa'll be home in the morning, he said. Your Pa won't be home for a week. Dewey began to bind Charlie's leg to stop the flow of blood, and the dog whimpered and licked the boy's hand with his warm tongue. Dewey split one end of the cloth and wound it around the leg, then tied it in a knot. Now lie there, he said, and don't move around or you'll make the bleeding worse. His grandma had begun to cry, not noisily, so Dewey didn't notice at first, but when he glanced up from the dog's leg, he saw the tears rolling down her cheeks. Unchecked, they fell onto her blouse, and she made no effort to wipe them away. Her tears upset him almost more than the encounter with the Indian. In all his life, he had never seen a woman cry. He had heard his mother cry the night they knew Pa wasn't going to die with fever, the night Pa had looked at her for the first time in weeks and had recognized her, but those had been happy tears. These seemed hopeless, and there was no sound at all. I only saw one of them, Grandma, and he's gone. He left on his pony. She said nothing, did not even look at him, and the tears continued to slip down her cheeks. I said the Indian's gone, he said slowly. We'll probably never see him again. She took a deep breath that rattled in her throat. Oh, we'll see him again, and a dozen of his brothers. She still did nothing about the tears. Don't say that. He had known this himself the moment he had seen the fire on the horizon, but he didn't want to hear it. Then he said, if they come back, we'll hide. That's it. We'll just hide, Grandma. Sometimes at night he thought about what he would do if raiding Indians came, and this is what he had decided. He would hide, flatten himself in the wheat, and wait. Sometimes in the hot summer afternoons, he'd even gone and hidden to see how long he could remain absolutely still. There ain't no place an Indian can't find you, she said dully. They got animal noses. They can smell you out. Well, it's better than just sitting here, ain't it? At least if we was hiding somewhere, we'd have a chance. We ain't got no chance, boy. We have too got a chance. No chance at all. The suggestion that there was no hope for him made him furious, and he grabbed her hands. We have too got a chance, and don't you say anything different. I'll get some things together, and we'll get out of here. She did not speak. The fear of Indians had been with her since they came to the prairie. She never left the cabin without first scanning the waving grass for some sign of their presence. Indians had sometimes passed the cabin, lean and dusky, on their shaggy, neglected ponies. They had come into the cabin, eaten corn cakes and deer before their fireplace, dropping on their haunches and never lifting their eyes from the hearth. They won't harm anyone, Pa had said again and again, and Dewey had looked at the Indians and believed him. There were no words, however, that could lessen Grandma's fear. In her mind were the terrible stories of Indian massacres, of families wiped out, of children stolen, of women scalped. These tales had been passed from cabin to cabin, had grown in the retelling, and now, in this wide-open prairie where there was no place to hide, they tormented her. Tonight it seemed all her fears were coming true. She sat in her chair, dully watching him as he yanked a blanket from the bed, laid it on the floor, and began to pile things into it. He took what food there was on the shelf, on the table, and by the fireplace, and threw it on the blanket. Without looking at his grandma, he tied the end securely, and then crossed the room and picked up the gun. Come on, Grandma, we better. And then he paused. He swallowed. Grandma! Grandma! She sensed the urgency in his voice and feared the Indians were upon them. Where? She asked, half rising from her chair. Grandma, listen to me. He grabbed her hand. We'll go down the river to the Dargans. Grandma, we'll go down the river. She looked at him, right at him, for the first time. What are you talking about, boy? I'm talking about my boat. We'll get on it and we'll float down the river. Grandma, we can do it. I know we can. Down the river? Yes'm. If we can get to the Dargans, they'd help us. You could stay there until Ma and Pa came back. Yes, the Dargans would help us, she admitted. Then come on, Grandma. She hesitated. All right, then don't come, he said. Just you sit there till the Indians come if you want to. Just sit there and wait for the Indians. She stood up and reached for her cane in one motion. I'll try, she said. I didn't come 1,000 miles to have no Indian take my scalp. You get them things down to the boat and we'll get started. He took the bundle, picked up the oar from the doorway, and moved awkwardly down the path. He flung them onto the raft and hurried back to the cabin. His grandma was stepping to the door. In the time it had taken for him to run down to the raft and back, she had gotten ready. Her bonnet, the white one with lace that she saved for special occasions, was on her head, and in her hands was her velour satchel. I'll get the dog, he said. Charlie struggled to his feet, and Dewey grabbed him around the middle. Without pausing, he ran with him to the raft. Wait there, he said, and then ran back up the path to help his grandma. Don't upset me now, she cried as he ran toward her. She shook her cane at him. I won't, Grandma. I'll just take your satchel for you. She handed it to him and said, You take care of that, boy. Every valuable I've got in the world is in that satchel. Yes'm. She looked back into the cabin, at the kettle on the fireplace, at the dough she had put on the hearth, at the clean bedding, at the cradle hollowed out like a tiny dugout from a cottonwood log. Quickly, while she was standing there, Dewey ran to the pig pens. He opened the first pen and shooed the pigs out into the clearing. Get, you get now. The pigs, startled, moved out of the pen and started looking back at him, snorting softly. He opened the pen where the two fattened boars had risen to their feet and were looking at him. Get, you, get. Before his pa had left, he had said, When we get back, first thing we'll kill the hogs. And Dewey's mouth had watered at the thought of a juicy ham. Get, you want the Indians to eat you? Get. The red boars moved out of the pen. Dewey moved to the door and to the sod barn and let out Brownie and her calf. By habit, they turned slowly and started walking down the path to the fenced pasture by the river. Get, he said, waving his grandma's satchel. The cow and her calf quickened their pace, slowed as Dewey went back to the cabin, then stopped. Come on, Grandma. Carefully, one step at a time, she left the cabin and made her way down the bank. So intent was she on finding secure footing that she was all the way to the edge of the river before she got her first glimpse of the Rosie Bee. There she is, Dewey said proudly, as he saw her look at the raft. She didn't speak for a moment. She couldn't. The word boat had brought to mind a sturdy craft. She remembered the heavy steamboats of the Missouri with their upper decks loaded with wagons and keelboats built to carry men and beasts and boats that would not tip or splinter no matter how swift the current. The sight of the log raft stunned her. This here's the boat, she said finally. Sensing her dismay, he said quickly, Well, it'll get us there, Grandma. She closed her eyes for a moment. In the moonlight, she seemed pale, washed of strength. Are you all right, Grandma? She opened her eyes and straightened her shoulders and said, I'm all right. Let's get. She paused a moment, and then she said firmly, aboard. Wait a minute, Grandma. Just wait. He ran back up the path and into the cabin. When he returned, he was carrying her rocking chair upside down on his head. This was the chair she had brought with her on the long trip west, strapped on the side of the wagon, and now she managed a faint smile. Grandma, you're going down the river in style, he said, like a lady on a steamboat. He set the chair on the center of the raft and, standing knee-deep in the water, helped her aboard. She clutched his shoulder so tightly he thought his flesh would be bruised by her fingertips. Then she was on the raft, sitting gingerly in her chair. I don't like it. I'll push off, Dewey said quickly before she could decide to go back to the cabin. He lifted the noose of rope from around the tree stump and dropped it on the raft and pushed it slowly out from the bank. His feet were stuck on the loose, muddy bottom, and he drew them out. He thought of quicksand. He scrambled aboard. The weight of his body caused the raft to dip momentarily, and his grandma cried, Don't upset me, boy, and almost struck him on the head with the cane in her alarm. It's all right, Grandma, it's all right. See how steady we are now. She placed her cane across her lap and settled back in the chair. I want to tell you one thing, boy, before we get started. We're already started, Dewey said, watching the bank slip away. She ignored him. Before we get started, I want to say one thing. I didn't come no 1,000 miles out in this wild land to be scalped. Yes'm, you told me. That's just the first part. She paused. Also, I didn't come no 1,000 miles out here to be drowned neither. Understand me, boy? Yes'm, I won't drown you. He swallowed if I can help it. When I die, it's going to be in my bed, and I'm going to be buried yonder by the plum trees with my feet pointing east so I can see the sun rising on Judgment Day. You hear me, boy? Yes'm. All right, then. We can get started now, she said. But I'll tell you one more thing. I don't trust this here boat, and I don't trust this here river. Ain't neither of them anything to look at. From the first moment she had seen Trouble River, she had mistrusted it. It was nothing like the beautiful rivers in the east. Its waters were murky and discolored, and from a distance it appeared to be yellow, on closer inspection merely muddy. It was broad, but not deep, with banks of sand or clay, and only an occasional grove of cottonwoods for shade. The creeks that emptied into it were called Dry Gulch, Dead Man's Creek, Salt Run, Rusty Springs. These streams, plus the groundwater from the sand hills, were all that kept this river flowing throughout the year. It was like a snake, moving slowly with coiling, twisting movements through the prairie grass.